So this bike does have a wet weight of 481 pounds, and that is a pretty heavy bike, but when you're moving it around, it doesn't feel like it's 480 pounds. The V-Strom, I believe, weighed, I think it was 490 pounds. So the V-Strom felt a little bit more top heavy than this bike. So of course I'm comparing it to the V-Strom 650 because I just sold that for this one. But the V-Strom did feel a little bit more top heavy than this. And the reason this one feels a little bit lighter, especially at low speeds, is that the engine is just so far forward. There's a pretty interesting feature about this NC700. It's one single rotor up front. Normally most bikes of this size have two rotors in the front, but this one's got one very large rotor, and it seems to be it's enough stopping power for this bike. It's an extremely massive rotor, and I don't know many bikes that do have one single rotor up front, but it is kind of fascinating that Honda decided to go with one single rotor. Up front here you have conventional forks on the NC, and there's nothing particularly great about these forks. They're conventional, they're like standard throughout the entire motorcycle industry, especially budget bikes. They usually have this. You could upgrade this to progressive springs and gold Racetech emulators or Racetech springs, whatever, and that's going to give you a much better feel of suspension rather than having this. And I have ridden this thing around town and on some gravel roads, and it's not great. The better suspension is in the higher end bikes. And remember, the NC is a budget bike, and that's one of the reasons I do like it, because it's a budget bike. I often find myself wondering why anybody needs these $20,000 motorcycles when something like this works. There's nothing wrong with the forks, it's just the suspension is not as good as it should be. But for a very small amount of money, you can upgrade this to very good forks. Another really great feature of this particular setup on the NC, because it doesn't have a lot of plastic, is this bolt. Why is this bolt that important? Well, if you ever do any fork maintenance or fork seals, this is so exposed you don't have to do a lot of plastic removing or try to squeeze in a wrench in between plastic. It's right there. The top front bolt, it's easily reached with a wrench. So this front fork is one of the easiest ones I've seen that you can work on. The radiator is easily accessible. I mean, this bike is so easy to work on. All you have to do is remove this bolt, and then this should pop out. I kind of wish they made a twisting cap that was a little bit more standard than having this bolt. It just adds to a little bit more time consumed like in doing this, but it's no big deal. But since I'm a complainer, I always see these things. I do like that Honda started putting these turn signals on their bikes. I think these look so much better than the square ones. It's just a nice touch. You know, a lot of makers are starting to do that. So the engine is really something that's very interesting about this bike. So normally bikes have the cylinder head pointing directly up. This one has it at a 62 degree going forward. It's very unconventional, and the closest thing I've heard people compare this to is a Honda Fit engine. It's a car, a Honda Fit or a Honda Jazz, and it's just kind of like aimed forward at 62 degrees. And it doesn't really do much, but it gives it a little bit like lower end torque. This engine, I was surprised. It's a 670cc engine. They call it 700. The V-Strom I was just riding, it was like 640 something cc. The V-Strom made 62 horsepower. This only makes 49 to 50 horsepower, I believe. So it's very low on power. And I would think this would make comparable numbers to the V-Strom. I think one of the interesting things is the engine, of course, because normally makers don't make things for working on. The great thing about this thing is that you can adjust the valves yourself. It uses one of the older school of valve adjustment. It's the ones with the nuts. And those are the only ones I really know how to adjust. The ones with the shims like the V-Strom had, I don't know how to adjust it. It's really time consuming and you need the shims. But this one, all you have to do is remove this radiator, and it's a very easy, there's a couple bolts here. You can remove it or kind of slide it out the way, and then you have so much area to work on because the front of the engine is right here. If you remove this, you should be able to pull out the cover and adjust the valves extremely easy. This is not the case for a lot of motorcycles. A lot of motorcycles require the shims, and the shim system keeps the adjustment longer than this sort of style, but at least this is a much better engine for a home mechanic like me. One thing that Honda did put on this bike, even though it's not a dual sport by any means, the V-Strom is a little bit better dual sport than this. They put a bash plate, and it's pretty well protected. Like, it just protects this front part of the engine, and you even have a side cover here, and it's nice to have. It looks a little bit more budge. A lot of people do put like some metal sort of bash plates, but I often find that you can do much better with just plastic. The type of rocks you're going to be hitting on this are not going to be like trees that you're going to be climbing over. So this is extremely good for the type of riding that I do. You do have the horn here. It's pretty exposed, but you know, honestly, you're not going to be hitting a lot of stuff. I find that a lot of people, they get these big plates, these big aluminum and steel plates on their bikes. They're just kind of like pretending that they're going off-road, and most are not, but some are, and they kind of like the idea of an adventure. That's why BMW GS's sell. It's the image that sells, not so much the bike. This is a very pragmatic bike for pragmatic people. It's the same thing with the V-Strom. It gives you enough of exactly what you want without anything additional, and there's something really beautiful about having a simple bike that's easy to live with. Now, the plate where it sits and the taillight might not be everybody's taste. It sits so far away, perched behind the actual rear seat of the bike, and it might not work for a lot of people, but I do kind of like it. I like that it kind of stands out and it's kind of perched, but I think a lot of people do tend to remove this chunk, and I bet it's pretty easy to remove, but then you can remove this amount of plastic that kind of sits out here if you don't like it. But I do like the way it looks. It's just, you know, it's different, it's European the way it looks, and it's easy to like remove the tire because it's so thin, it's pointy. And a lot of times older school bikes, even 2005, they have so much plastic that come all the way to here, so normally you have to kind of try and remove the rear wheel and go around the plastic, but I don't think this is going to be hitting this little tippy point here. Everything in this rear section is integrated. You have the brake lights and the blinkers, so it looks kind of dual sportish, and I think it looks stylish. I've seen this in other bikes and I think it looks pretty good. On the rear seat, the passenger seat, it's pretty narrow. The V-Strom, for example, had a much wider rear seat and it was much squarish. This kind of tapers off into the tail, which looks really nice and sporty. And I think your passengers are really going to love this sort of grab rail. It is extremely big. It feels pretty good on the hand. The V-Strom also had that. So this seat is the gas tank. And you might not think it's that bad of a deal, but as a guy that rides cross country often, every year, I do try to strap things to this rear seat. For example, my tent. I'll put it here, I'll put my sleeping bag, because it's hard to fit stuff on a Gibby side case that's a little bit too long. So this makes a perfect space to put stuff. And the problem is you have to open up this rear seat to fill up. So you would have to remove things in order to fill up. But there's also another really interesting thing, is that some riders that want more of a range will put a gas tank here, and because it's gravity fed, you can somehow, you know, put a tube into the gas tank, and then you can increase your range with an additional 200 miles depending on the capacity of the tank that you put there. Wise, I think the NC700 looks extremely good. I do prefer the looks of this over the V-Strom, but I think the V-Strom is more of a rider's type of bike. It gives you a little bit more oomph than this one. The way of the way this bike rides is very different than a standard motorcycle, and this is a brilliant bike for taking to work because it's got some major benefit. One of the great things about this particular bike is this. You would think that the gas tank is here, but it's not, of course. You put your key here and then you twist it to the right, and then you open this compartment. This compartment is freaking huge. Not only you have a cavity here in this top, you also can put a full-size helmet inside of here. And I'm just using it to put like various things. This is probably one of the greatest features I've seen in a bike. I do love this idea because if you are a commuter, you're going to be relying on this. It beats having a book bag. And the reason Honda has got such a large amount here on the NC is that the engine is angled at 62 degrees forward, and of course there is no gas tank here, so it's a brilliant concept. And also another really interesting thing is that you also have the battery here. Using 2 screws you can kind of pull it out, and then you can attach all your electronics here. So a lot of times when you have a motorcycle, the battery is underneath your seat, and then you have to run cables from the battery underneath your gas tank to your handlebars where you're going to be using it. For example, a GPS or maybe your heated gear. But this is a much quicker route to the handlebars than the seat. So in a way, I thought in the beginning that the battery placement was kind of odd, but I do like it now. All you do to open up the front case is turn the key to the right. To open the gas tank, the rear seat, you turn it to the left, and now you can open up the rear seat, and of course it stays up, so that's a really good feature to have. The things I don't like is Honda's type of gas caps that you have to kind of like put around here, and I don't think there's a good place to put it, but yeah, since this is kind of like open and you do have to get off the bike to fill this bike up, I guess you could kind of like turn your body the other way, but I find that it's a little bit hard to fill back here. It could just be me that I'm not used to it, but it's extremely handy to have. I prefer just the caps that just kind of bounce out. A better idea for the placement of the gas tank, I don't mind it here at all, but I would prefer it, the gas filler, to be off to the side, kind of like what they do in BMW F series. That way you can still use the rear seat to put stuff on a tour and concentrate on just filling and going, instead of like unpacking stuff from here and having to, you know, tie things down over again. It is nice that when you open up the seat, you do have a way of propping up the seat so you don't have to constantly be pushing it down. There are 2 bolts here that you can remove to remove the front seat, and you just kind of pop them out and you should be able to reach underneath the seat. Now I do like comfortable bikes. This is plenty comfortable for me, but I think a lot of people might not like the seat. I think it's well designed. It's wider down here and then much thinner up front. Also the way they cut the seat on the sides, you basically have an easier way of reaching to the ground. And so if I sit here, because they've removed a little bit over here, so the seat up here is so much narrower, I can flat foot this. But on the V-Strom, I had a little bit of a harder time flat footing the bike because the seat was so much more square. So your legs tend to go a little bit wider. This is a much nicer profile for shorter riders. So different than my V-Strom 650 because there's so much less happening here. This is a much simpler bike than the V-Strom. You have so much less plastic, everything is much more narrow, and that makes it a much better commuter bike, but it also makes it a worse highway bike. On this left side, you have your high beams, you have your hazards button. So, you know, one thing I do like about Honda is the fit and finish of like this instrument panel. V-Strom's was the same way. One thing I don't like right off the bat is that the horn is here, the turn signals are here, and previously to this bike everything was reversed. Honda started doing that on their CB500 as well, but I would rather have the turn signals up here in bigger buttons and the horn down here. I don't know about you, but I don't use the horn every day. I'm not honking at people left and right. It seems to me it's much more important to have good turn signal reach than the horn, and the horn should be like down here. That's just me, but it's kind of an annoyance. One thing that kind of like stands out is that the quality of the handlebars does not look very good. There's something a little bit off about this sort of handlebar and like the clamps. It feels very much like this is a budget bike, and I think they could have done a much better job in designing this bike and having better handlebars, for example, than these. The V-Strom, when you got a hold of the handlebars, it felt like it's a much more substantial bike, even though they're almost exactly the same riding position. I kind of feel like they skipped out on the materials up front here. On this right side, you have a big button for the kill switch, and then of course you have your starter right here. And this button, these buttons seem like it's decent quality. And of course on the right side you do have your throttle. Everything is by cable. There's nothing like particularly great about this. It's a very simple system. The position lets you see extremely well out the mirrors. I do like that they decided to design it in this sort of shape instead of the round and the square. This looks much more modern. If you ever buy a used NC700 and it's got this sort of thing around it, it's Honda's ignition thing, so make sure that you get 2 keys because these are expensive to make. It also has the lock, the steering lock to the left. Let's go ahead and start this bike up. The nature of this inline 2-cylinder bikes, they're not great sounding bikes. It's an extremely quiet bike, and if you're looking for a bike that sounds great, probably the NC is not the right bike for you. The wet weight of this bike is 481 pounds wet. So it isn't a heavy bike, but I think it hides its weight extremely well because the gas tank is so far down. And of course, the front engine is just so far forward and down that it feels much lighter than it is. And the gas tank is just so much further down than a conventional bike that this bike, when you move it around the garage, you can feel it right away. Feels much lighter. One of the great benefits as well of the NC700 and NC750X is that this bike gets phenomenal gas mileage. And a lot of people might not even care about that, but I do. A lot of days, these motorcycles that are 1300cc get mileage similar to a car. But this thing gets 65 miles per gallon, and I've heard of other owners that have gotten 80 to 90 miles per gallon. So that's an incredible amount of mileage that you can get. Up here you have your tach, and it's a nice digital tach. And then you have 2 buttons here. One is really the trip, and then one is the reset. So you can cycle through the trip here, and your odometer, your trip. This one's got 10,000 miles. And of course in the middle here, you have your miles per hour. And on this right side, you have your fuel gauge, which is currently full. And of course, if you wanted to reset, push and hold, and then you just reset. Up here you have your dummy lights and turn signal indicators. Let's start the bike so you can hear it and see the tach running here. I think that's a nice feature. It's a very svelte bike. It's a very svelte bike. It's very simple The design is not in your face. The instrument panels are much nicer than the old school instrument panels that require a lot of like tachometer and speedometer. I like the system of condensing everything into one little unit that weighs less. The suspension, it's not great on this. And I looked up the wheelbase of this bike, and it's almost exactly the same as the V-Strom 650 that I just sold. So I was kind of surprised because it feels a little bit squirmier and not as stable as the V-Strom. So that's something that I have to kind of like pay attention to. But the brakes are extremely good for having one caliper and one disc brake. This feels like some of the better brakes I've had. I'm learning how to ride it. You know, it's a lot of times it takes a little bit of time to understand the bike, but the FJR I bought actually feels a lot harder to ride than this. You gotta admire the adventure rider position because this thing is so easy, so maneuverable. Yeah, this bike definitely likes to go slower than the V-Strom, but with 20 less horsepower, 15 to 20 less horsepower than the V-Strom, that makes sense that it's slower. I believe that the new NC750s are a little bit more powerful and behave a little bit more like a motorcycle. But you know, it's not like I'm missing the power. It almost feels like a powerful Ninja 250, and that's a compliment. I love the European styling of this bike. The silver doesn't really work for me that well. I prefer red, the red NC700. It feels very comfortable. It feels very similar to the V-Strom or any adventure bike. And one of the things I like about this particular one is the speedo. Now, I do wish that they put a miles per gallon calculation or calculator in there. I'm kind of surprised. And I'm surprised they don't have a temperature gauge on this one. I mean, that's kind of just shoddy. It's easy enough to do that these days. I don't understand why Honda decided to skip on that. You basically just get like trip 1, trip 2, and then an odometer. But that's it's pretty simple. I really wish there was a little bit more to the electronics, because the CB500 does have that miles per gallon calculation. And the thing is, a lot of commuters that are pragmatic, they just think in terms of very basic transportation. They like to know their miles per gallon, because, you know, this bike is a calculation. It's not like it's a passion buy. So a lot of people get this knowing that it's a bike that gets close to 70 miles per gallon, and it's a 700cc, the same sort of miles per gallon you would get in a Ninja 250. That's incredible. I mean, the bike feels really good, and if the weight on this is so much further down than the V-Strom, I'm very surprised. It definitely feels like you can toss it around in corners well, but I am missing a little bit of the power. You know, it is a very pleasant bike to ride. It's not, you know, in a way I almost feel like it's a hybrid. When you drive a hybrid, no matter what, you know, it could be like a BMW i3, Prius, you know, a lot of people would make fun of it, but they're actually quicker than what most people think they are. You know, I always surprise people when I pull out of red lights, because everybody just assumes it's slow, but it's not that slow. This bike is not that slow. It's still faster than most cars, and it's very easy to reach the ground. I can flat foot this. My V-Strom, I struggled a bit, and I think it's the same seat height, but the only reason it feels a little bit different is that the V-Strom, the seats were much wider. So when you have wide seats, your legs have to kind of spread out a little bit more. This one is not the case, because they tapered the seat in the front a lot further down, so you don't have to reach too much to get to it. So I think there's something very beautiful about this bike, something great about it. It's just it's an inexpensive bike in a world of very expensive heavy bikes that people have forgotten what motorcycles are all about. It's incredible. Everybody's getting these very fast, powerful bikes. There was a time where people started to go back to small bikes, and it lasted for a very short amount of time. And now everybody's buying extremely big, fast, and heavy bikes. But this bike has everything that most people would want in a very small package that's very easy to live with. But I don't know if it's very popular. I don't see a lot of them. They do hold their value in the marketplace, which is, I guess it's good for me. But it's a fantastic bike, and if you guys want a good commuter, this is probably one of the better ones you could. Well, that's the NC700X, guys. I hope you enjoyed this review, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.